with using brain imaging, we might be able to actually quantify in a non-invasive way the quality and the content of mitochondria in someone's brain, which I think would be revolutionary.
Mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, but oh so much more. And nobody knows this better than Dr. Martin Picard, one of the leading researchers in the field of mitochondria and how mitochondria influence wellness and sickness and disease. And now he has a new groundbreaking study published in Nature that tells us about the mitochondria in our brain with some surprising findings and how that might relate to brain energy and brain energy dysfunction and how that leads to brain-based disorder. So here's this fascinating interview with Dr. Martin Picard. All right, Dr. Martin Picard, thank you so much for joining me again here on Metabolic Mind. Thank
you. I'm delighted.
Yeah, so anybody who hasn't listened to our first interview back in August of 2023, which has almost 500,000 views on YouTube, means people were very interested in what you had to say, which I think is amazing because your enthusiasm for mitochondria and your knowledge for mitochondria are so great. And I think that's why that episode resonated. But for those who haven't seen that, bring us up to date. Who's Dr. Martin Picard?
I'm a mitochondrial psychobiologist, and I care to understand the mind-body connection, but in particular, the mind-mitochondria connection. And I think it's clear that what makes us tick and what allows us to be alive and to feel and experience the world around us is the energy that flows through our body, our minds, our brains, and then creates a human experience. So this is a big gap in knowledge in science. We don't know how the biology of our cells, of our mitochondria, actually relate to how we feel and how we experience the world around us. So what we're doing is with my team is focusing on mitochondria as a transducer and kind of the portal that changes the food we eat, the oxygen we breathe into energy that actually brings us to life. So that's what we do.
Yeah. And, I think we have meaning like the general public or even the medical community tends to have a very simplistic understanding of mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. They are the little part in the cell that take in nutrients and create it to ATP or to energy. So they're the energy producers of the cells. But your research and your work is showing it so much more than that mitochondria are so much more than just the energy producers of our cells. And that energy and that ability to produce energy has so many permutations. So, I know it's impossible to sum up in a minute, but how crucial, how important, what big of a role do mitochondria play in our mental and physical health?
Yes, that's a big question. First thing, from first principles in physics, energy is neither transformed nor destroyed, right? I think a lot of people will have heard this. Energy cannot materialize or be destroyed. It's only transformed.
Right. So it's not created or destroyed. It's transformed.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So mitochondria don't produce energy per se. What they do is they transform energy from one form, which is biochemistry and the energy of the sun trapped into molecules of food, right? And then mitochondria are able to dematerialize this, to turn, material energy and biochemistry into electrochemical energy, just like charging a little battery. And then once mitochondria are charged, now they can bring the rest of the cell to life. And they do this by producing ATP, which is maybe the producing energy that we hear sometimes in the powerhouse analogy, which is expired now. But then they do all sorts of other things, dozens of other functions and behaviors that if you look at mitochondria inside a living cell, you see them do all of these things. And it's remarkable. For example, they make hormones like cortisol that allows us, to have resilience and to respond to challenges. Cortisol is made in the mitochondria, and even the hormones that allow new human life, reproduction, right? Like what allows the woman body to become pregnant and to grow a whole other human being that requires estrogen and progesterone. Those hormones are made in your mitochondria. So there's some really deep connection between what mitochondria do and, the movement of life through the human organism and then, through the movement of the human mind. And fundamentally, I think the human mind is an energy pattern. It is energy that we eat and then we breathe oxygen, and then mitochondria transform that energy into something that feels like something. So as energy fluxes through mitochondria, we have good reasons to believe that's where, the magic happens, and where maybe consciousness arises in the depth of mitochondria as energy is transformed from one form to another. So we think that the way we evolved, right, and 1.5 to 2 billion years ago is when there was a really magical event that happened when mitochondria were like free living bacteria. And then you have other types of, unicellular organisms, like single cell things that didn't do very much other than eat and reproduce, a bit like cancer cells. And then at some point, these two came together, and the aerobic, the oxygen consuming bacterium was kind of either colonized the bigger cell or was engulfed by the bigger cell. Like there are debates about this, but regardless, this union, this was like the vital union. It's called endosymbiosis, which means working together from the inside. Endosymbiosis. And endosymbiosis of mitochondria is what allowed multicellular life to happen. And then, you had organisms that came out of this, and then brains evolved, and then minds, and then what we know about life now. So this was a really critical event. And then all of these important functions like making stress hormones, making sex hormones somehow evolved to be located in the same part of the cell that transforms the energy that keeps us alive.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you talk about it, and I always just get so inspired by your enthusiasm about talking about it as well. But you mentioned the brain. You mentioned the brain and consciousness and brain function, and of course here at Metabolic Mind we talk a lot about brain energy. Dr. Chris Palmer has the whole book, Brain Energy, and there's been this, rightfully so, this focus on how energy is transformed in the brain. But what you did. You published a paper just recently in Nature that's been referred to as groundbreaking, and all these just really a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? A lot bestowed upon this paper about how important it is. Where you took a brain and sectioned it into over 700 sections to look at the mitochondria, not only in the different sections, but in the different cell types, and to see how it would relate to imaging. I mean, it seems like a huge effort to have this many sections of brain, but tell us about what made you want to do this study, and then we can get into sort of what you found from it.
Yeah. This project was a huge endeavor, and I wasn't sure initially how we would go about doing this, because if you want a major barrier and why nobody had done this before is because there's a massive scale gap between the way cell biologists measure mitochondria and kind of the biology of at the cellular level. There's a resolution issue. Biologists focus on the really tiny and then single cell or mitochondria, but then we know that experiences and what actually matters to human life doesn't happen like at the single cell level. It happens at the whole brain level. And as far as we understand, we form memories, retrieve memories. We experience things not because there's like this one brain region that stores, the memory of your grandmother. It's because there's patterns of activity, patterns of energy that the brain generates that allows to, and it gives rise to those cognitive capabilities and those emotional states and experiences. So the brain kind of operates as a unit, as a whole unit, but then our methods in biology to look at mitochondria require like really small pieces. And so what we wanted to do was create a tool for the community, for the scientific community, where we have mapped systematically, not just in our favorite brain region. This is how neuroscience, progresses very often. If you love the hippocampus, then you do everything hippocampus. If you love, the putamen, then you do this. And then if you like the cortex, then, you do this. And we wanted to be agnostic and say energy flow through the whole brain is what matters. How do we develop a map that actually shows us the machinery, right? The hardware, the mitochondrial hardware that allows the brain to flux its energy. And part of the motivation behind this was the fact that the brain is a pretty small piece of your body. If you weigh the brain and you weigh the whole body, the brain weighs about 2% of your whole body weight. So 2%, that's not that big. But then if you actually measure the energy that is consumed by different parts of the body, and then you find that the brain consumes about 20%, 20 to 25% of the whole body's energy budget. So 2%, but consumes this much energy. So there's a clear disconnect there. The brain is tremendously energetically expensive, and this all of this energy fluxes, needs to happen through mitochondria. So it's amazing. We, until now we hadn't had a map of like how many mitochondria are there in different parts of the cortex and the subcortical region and the hippocampus and the white matter. So that was the motivation to establish the hardware that allows the brain to run its amazing malleable software, and that we call the mind and the human experience. And then technically this was really challenging. So we found a way to voxelize, basically turn a frozen piece of brain into small little cubes that are consistent with the scale at which we can do mitochondrial assays. So this was the real challenge and the technical tour de force in this project. My colleague Eugene Masharov, who thinks like an engineer, he's a chemist by training, but he works in a neuroscience lab. And then we came up with this idea of using a machine that is used for engraving things, like woodworkers use this like to engrave a heart in a piece of wood, for your mom's birthday, for example. So you can program the machine so it can engrave in 3D, whatever shape you want. And then Eugene programmed the machine so that it would engrave a grid of little cubes that are the same size as the MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging techniques use. So what MRIs do, when you put someone in a scanner, you get these beautiful pictures of brain activity. The machine actually sections the brain into virtual cubes, which are called voxels. Pixel is 2 dimension. Voxel is the volume, a pixel in volume. So we created physical voxels instead of just virtual voxels that an MRI would do. And then that was the key step in making this possible. And like you said, we ended up with 703 voxels, which was by far the largest kind of study of this kind we did. And then we had 2 courageous students who teamed up to do the assays with those hundreds of samples.
Yeah, I think it's great that you did it to correlate with the MRI, because that's, living human beings, we can't section their brains, but we can get MRI. So any information that's going to be able to be relatable to those exams is pretty key. But I love the story about the engraving tool and using that, because when the science doesn't exist, right, the techniques don't exist, you've got to be creative. You've got to figure out a way to do it. And I think that's fantastic that you really were thinking outside the box for this project. So with that as the setup, I mean, it's so interesting what you found about, the more recent, the more evolved or less evolved parts of the brain, the white matter, the gray matter, how the density of mitochondria were different and the types of cells where the mitochondria were different. What was the main conclusions?
The main conclusion is that the number of mitochondria are very specifically distributed across the brain. Some brain areas have more mitochondria than others. And that is not totally unexpected if we look at the rest of the body, because there are other parts of the body, there are organs in our bodies that have many more mitochondria than others. The heart, for example, has a lot of mitochondria. The heart is, by volume, is about almost 30% mitochondria, 20 to 30%. And the muscle, for example, which is another kind of muscle, similar to the heart in some ways, has only like 2 and at most 5% of its volume that are mitochondria. So there are different amounts of mitochondria in different parts of the body. And if you exercise, you can actually make more mitochondria in different parts of the body. So now we found the brain also, and there are different parts of the brain that have more or less mitochondria. And then when we ask, which part of the brain have more mitochondria, what's unique between those that have more, those that have less. And then my colleague, Michel Thibault de Schoten, who's a neuroanatomist, but also a neuropsychologist, and he's an expert of brain imaging in Bordeaux in France. He found that the brain regions that have most mitochondria are those regions that have more recently evolved. And also those regions, if you look at the monkey brain versus the human brain, there are parts of the brain that expanded significantly as or transition from monkeys to humans. And those parts of the brain that recently expanded have mitochondria that not only that have more mitochondria, but their mitochondria were specialized for energy transformation, suggesting that, and this kind of put us put the idea in our minds that mitochondria specialize And even in the brain, and we know this, the heart mitochondria, the muscle mitochondria, the liver mitochondria are all different in their qualities, and the types of mitochondria, we call those mitotypes. And then I think at the beginning of this project, I thought, well, there's going to be one type of brain mitochondria, and there's going to be more or less in different places. We actually found there are different kinds of mitochondria across the brain. And then Anna Monzel, computational scientist in our lab, analyzed single cells in 4 different brain areas. And then she was able to ask, are the mitochondria different in between excitatory neurons or inhibitory neurons, 2 different populations of cells in the brain, or microglia or astrocytes or oligodendrocytes, also different types of cells that make the brain work. Those cell types have different kinds of mitochondria. So there are different mitotypes in this beautiful organ that is the brain, and then there are different parts of the brain that have more and parts of the brain that have less. So this is just revealing the complexity, the diversity, and just further showing the beauty of of mitochondria in the human brain. Just amazing.
Yeah, and work that's really never been done before. So really groundbreaking work to show this type of specialization and differentiation. So then, and to bring it back to sort of clinical implications. I mean, a lot of the times people will, I guess, push back against the brain energy theory or, the role mitochondria play and say, well, if it's all about energy in mitochondria, why do some people present as depression, or some people present as bipolar disorder, or some schizophrenia, or whatever the case may be, right? Or some don't present at all. Like, why would there be that difference? So I guess you could hypothesize, well, it depends on which cells, which part of the brain, which mitochondria, like it's not just one thing. So is that sort of a clinical jump you could potentially make from your research?
Well, it's certainly a valid hypothesis, I think. And there are 2 things that I think lend support to that the basis for inter-individual differences, why I might be vulnerable to one mental health disorder and someone else might be vulnerable to another one, even though we both experience this, quote unquote, the same kind of metabolic dysfunction. Those differences we think could lie in, maybe I have, based on how I've developed the food, I ate, and the kind of things I do in my life, and the kind of psychosocial factors that I've been exposed to, this could all shape how many mitochondria there are in different parts of my brain. And we just did a study where we analyzed in about 1,000 individuals post-mortem. So after they pass away, this large-scale national project went and sampled up to 50 different organs and tissues, 50. And then in sampling all of those organs, gene expression was measured. And then from the gene expression, we can ask in different tissues in the same person, how much resources are being invested into making mitochondria, which is kind of how many mitochondria does this person's liver have, and this person's heart, and this person's brain, and this person's kidney, and this person's adrenal glands that make hormones, and ovaries, and testes, and 50 different organs and tissues. And what we found was that there was very large differences between people. And the person, for example, that had lots of mitochondria in one part of the brain was not the person that also had lots of mitochondria in their heart or in the muscle. And there are people that had lots of mitochondria in their liver and their kidneys, but not so many in their muscles and their brain. And some other people had lots of mitochondria in the skin and and the gut and the digestive system, but not so many in the brain or the heart. So there seem to be unique distribution patterns of mitochondrial content, maybe mitochondrial qualities. And one hypothesis is maybe this actually drives some of our kind of what we call innate abilities, and or skills and our gifts and our talents. If you develop somehow and you end up with more mitochondria in one part of the brain or one organ, then maybe you're going to be like a really good athlete or a really good emotional listener or a really good social mother. So we think some of those inter-individual differences and phenotypes, which then interact with exposures and metabolic states, could drive individual susceptibilities or individual resiliencies against potential disorders or disease states. So I think that would explain why metabolic dysfunction can affect different people in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the body and especially the brain is sort of based on redundancy and sort of the support if something it goes wrong, what can take over. And it seems like density and type of mitochondria really fits into that sort of framework and that hypothesis for sure.
Yeah, there's remarkable findings where, some people lose a part of the brain because of an accident or because of a surgery, to remove, for example, a site of epilepsy, and then a whole lobe or, a whole, region of the brain can be removed. And then sometimes there are deficits, but then those deficits eventually can be, recovered. So there's tremendous plasticity, even, in an organ that most people think doesn't regenerate. There's tremendous plasticity. And what seems to matter is not so much, the structure of the brain and which neuron you have where and how, but the energy patterns that the brain is able to generate. And that can be achieved. You can achieve the same energy pattern, i.e. the same experience, through different, specific pathways. That's the concept of equifinality, right? You end up at the same final point, equifinality, but through different pathways. So, many roads, and many different, you can build a car in many different ways, but it's still going to drive you around, right? Even if it has 3 wheels or, 6 wheels or whatever.
Yeah. Very interesting. Now, one of the points we already mentioned was how you made these cuts and these samples sort of to correlate with the MRI cuts. Well, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, how do we measure mitochondrial function in real time? Like, how do I know how my brain mitochondria are? And it seems like there's still a ways to go to do that, but is there progress happening with certain scanners? Tell us about that, sort of the clinical utility of that.
Yeah, so that would be, the ultimate goal, and where we hope MitoBrain Map becomes useful is that you can put someone on a scanner, perform and different sequences. They're just different ways of scanning the brain, and then take that data, project it onto MitoBrain Map, use the algorithm that we developed, and then you can predict in this person's brain. You can see how many mitochondria are there in different parts, and we can even predict. It seems we need to validate this and confirm this in further studies, different properties or qualities of mitochondria with standard neuroimaging data. So if that's the case, and now we're planning, the follow-up study to look into this, if that's the case, we might be able to know how healthy the mitochondria are in this person's brain, and then do this again a month later, right? And then maybe another month later, and then or next year, and then actually follow and track people over time, and then ask, this new job that you started, is this hurting your brain mitochondria, or is this actually, helping and inspiring you? This new relationship or this new diet, it's clear that for some people, there are specific diets, be it keto or carnivore or, Mediterranean, or like different people respond differently to different diets. And I think we need to be clear about the fact that there's not going to be a one diet that is good for everyone. And different people have different needs, even at different times of their life. And intermittent fasting can be amazing for some individuals in the summer when they're really, really active. But then winter comes and things change. And so even at different times of year or different, phases of life, the nutritional needs of the brain, of the organism, can be quite different. And children, have very high energy expenditure between ages, 1 and 12, versus older adults, beyond age of 70, 80, very different. And those, the data, if you look at the system energetically, it's telling you these people should probably not eat the same thing, or not eat the same way, or not eat at the same frequency. And yet, my father still thinks that 3 meals a day, is the way to go. And the breakfast is the most important meal, even though I think, a little bit of intermittent fasting or, could probably do very well.
Yeah, it's funny to hear people. It seems like, especially people who are, I don't know, you want to come old school, or even sort of like old school military, even like 3 squares. They call it 3 squares, 3 square meals a day. Like, that's the way you do it. You can't skip a meal. It's like, it's funny how these concepts sort of get ingrained into our being and what we think is right.
Yeah.
Well,
so we hope that with with MitoBrain Map, sorry, uh, with using brain imaging, we might be able to actually quantify in a non-invasive way the quality and the content of mitochondria in someone's brain, which I think would be revolutionary. So we're doing a study now in 500 brains to see if that's the case and how good this might work. And then we're also developing blood and saliva tests where we're trying to identify circulating markers that you can just take a saliva sample and then you have some measure of what's the state of your energetic, we call energy resistance, right? How easily can energy flow through your organism, or how much resistance do you have in your mitochondria, and there are circulating proteins and markers that might get us at this systemically. So I think the field is evolving very quickly, and I'm hopeful, in a few years we might have some decent ways to quantify and even maybe to intervene at the energetic level, and not just with molecules that people need to take every month or every day or kind of in a repeated basis.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important future to look towards, because a lot of people say, well, it's this mentality of, well, if mitochondrial health is important, what can I take to improve it? Methylene blue, or red light therapy, or N-acetylcysteine, or whatever supplement that has been shown to have some incremental benefit. How do I know if those supplements are helping my mitochondria and if they need the help, right? Like, that level of transition isn't there yet, but that's what people are looking for. But we know, eat a healthy diet for you, maintain metabolic health, stay physically active, have a good circadian rhythm, get your sleep, have good social connections, right? All these things, which don't sound so groundbreaking, can help your mitochondria, but how do we measure that? That's what I think, I don't know. I think that's what a lot of people kind of say, well, I'm not going to worry about mitochondria because I can't test it, I can't measure it. But that's sort of that's kind of what you're marching towards with this revolutionary research, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, yes, we're marching towards developing quantifiable metrics of mitochondrial health. So I think that's one piece, and that's, I think, extremely valuable in this current context, where in our modern culture, like, if you can't measure it, it just ain't real. That's part of our culture. And I think once you start to think about yourself as an energetic process, right? Like, we have a physical body, right? And there's kind of the molecular structure and the anatomy and different parts of the brain and all of this. But so that's one dimension of you, like, which is like the physical dimension that you see in the mirror. But then there's the flow of energy through you is actually another dimension, right? That is a little harder to grasp, and we can't, sequence it. You can't run it on a gel or like look at it under the microscope. It's not a thing. It's energy flowing through you is actually fundamentally what you are. Because if energy stops flowing through you and through your brain, just you're gone, right? Your body's still there, the cells are still the same, your brain is still going to be intact and it's still going to be as beautiful, but without the constant flow of energy through the brain and through the body, you're dead, right? You don't exist. So it gets a little philosophical. You ask, like, what are you? Are you like a molecular machine, or are you an energetic process? And I think the truest answer, the answer is like, you're both, right? But if you ask what is most fundamental is not your physical existence. It is actually you as an energetic process. It's the flow of energy. And you can lose part of your anatomy, right? Like we said earlier, you can lose a lobe of your brain, you can lose an arm, you can lose, an organ, you can lose a kidney. And as long as energy keeps flowing to you, you will still be, relatively, the you part will still, remain intact. But if you lose energy flow, or if energy becomes mispatterned, right? The anatomical structures are all fine, but the energy is mispatterned, or the total amount of energy that flows through you goes down by just 10%. Now, I suspect this might be sufficient to cause, depression, or to cause, long COVID, or, chronic fatigue syndrome. And if your energy flow goes down by 20%, then you're dead. So I think this tells us how critical and how fundamental energy flow is to our existence, and ultimately to our mental health as well. So I think once you start to think about yourself as an energetic process, then some of the behaviors we know, of course, you need to do this, just makes so much more sense. Why do you need to sleep? You need to sleep so that your organism can go into a lower energy state, and then it can rejuvenate. It can, recover and consolidate memories and heal, right? The healing process just is naturally an energetic process, happens when we sleep and when we rest. And why would you want to fast? Because energetically, it stimulates a lot of important processes, like you make new mitochondria, you degrade old ones. And why would you want to foster social connections and hang out with people who bring you energy, right? Who you feel energized by? Well, there might literally be, an energetic process in your organism, in your mitochondria, that is triggered when you enter in resonance with another human being. And then if you are an energetic process, and this other person is an energetic process, now you're broadcasting energetic signals through your voice, through your gestures, right? And through your touch. And then this energetically affect the other person, this other energetic process. So then you enter into this dance, and maybe the best analogy there is that of like two strings, right, that are kind of tuned similarly. If one vibrates, there's waves that hit the other one, and then both vibrate together. And then this resonance might be what we experience as feeling energized by another person, by an idea, by a movement, or whatever you feel passionate about. So thinking about yourself, about these things and human experiences energetically, I think brings a whole other dimension to behaviors. And why would you do these things that are supposed to be good for you? And maybe it places the focus not so much on just things you can measure on the outside objectively with a lab test, but also on your own experience. And then if you're an energetic process more than a molecular machine, what you feel and what you experience on a daily basis, or maybe on a minute by minute basis, these are teachings from meditation, for example, and ancient tradition. You are the most sensitive instrument for knowing how you're doing energetically. So I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for self, monitoring and knowing, is this diet good for me or is this diet? If you eat mindlessly, it's really hard to know how this food affects you. But once you start to pay attention and you wear maybe a CKM, a CGM, continuous ketone or glucose monitor, then as additional help for your introspection or interoception, then maybe you actually can train yourself to become more in tune with your energetic state and how that affects your mental health, your physical health. And so I see a lot of potential for improving our health and helping each other and our patients to be to live more sustainable and healthier lives.
Wow, it's fascinating. I mean, to go from the microscopic subcellular level of research to what makes us who we are and our human experience, and to go from the smallest to the biggest, basically. I think drawing that connection is so fascinating, and that's why I'm always fascinated by the research you're doing. And I know you're working on so many projects concurrently, and you have so much kind of in the hopper. So if there's any projects you want to tell us about, please do so. And then also, where can people go to learn about all your work and read about it?
Yeah, thank you. What we've discussed today and a lot of what we do now, I'm integrated into a book called Energy. And it's about understanding ourselves as from an energetic perspective, and then what this means for our behaviors, for a relationship, for purpose, and then what it means for our place in the world, in the universe, and where the mind comes from, and where consciousness might arise from. So there's been an exciting process, and I hope the book comes out next year in 2026. And we're developing other projects that I think we need to shift the way we do science. We need to shift scientific culture, and we need to shift also popular culture, where I think very deeply ingrained in how we think about what is worth studying as scientists, and what is possible to do as a citizen that you want to improve your own health. The longer we think about ourselves as molecular machines, I think the longer we'll be led astray, and we'll be tempted to overdiagnose and put labels on dynamic energetic processes, and then fix experiences into disorders, and then want to molecularly intervene extremely aggressively. So I think we need to shift that discourse. So we're in the process of developing an institute to help make this possible for scientists to study those important questions that bring together the science of energy and the human experience, right? The fundamental engine of our lives in mitochondria, and the fundamental nature of what it means to be human, which is your experience. And those things have not been bridged. So that's what we're getting ready to do.
Great. And so I know you're on Twitter and X, so people can follow you there. And is there any particular website people can go to, or is that in transition?
People can go to picardlab.org. And then we have publications there and a few videos and some lectures that are available. But probably X is the most the platform where I'm most dynamically share about our recent work.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. It's always a pleasure and really sort of inspiring to talk to you and hear about the work that you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm inspired. Thanks for your work.
I want to take a brief moment to let our practitioners know about a couple of fantastic free CME courses developed in partnership with Bazuki Group by Dr. Georgia Eid and Dr. Chris Palmer. Both of these free CME sessions provide excellent insight on incorporating metabolic therapies for mental illness into your practice. They are approved for AMA Category 1 credits, CNE nursing credit hours, and continuing education credits for psychologists, and they're completely free of charge on mycme.com. There's a link in the description. I highly recommend you check them both out.